Hello, I'm Dale from Dale's Gig Reviews and Metalliville Online Magazine, and I'm joined by the legend Neil I've got your name, Neil Turbin. Sorry about
That's all right. We're not formal.
that. I were late to the party with Anthrax. I saw Anthrax in 1990, supporting Iron Maiden. So for me, Anthrax started with Persistence of Time, which is well after your time. But I then got into the back catalogue and I got heavily into the early stuff. I've got the first album, the debut album. I've got that on CD, but I've got the second one here, which you wrote the music for, I believe.
A couple of songs,
Yeah,
and they named it. Spread the disease was part of what we were gonna do. They changed it to spreading the disease, but spread the disease was, kind of the theme at the time on the tour. That was there was even a shirt that a fan made that said "Spread the disease." So I think that's where it came from.
yeah,
The
I,
idea for that. But I mean, I still have the shirt somewhere. It
yeah,
was a two-sided shirt and white logo on a black shirt that said, the Anthrax logo on the front, and on the back it said "Spread the disease." So that was, something a fan came up with, and we're
very
like, "Hey,
cool.
this is pretty cool."
Yeah.
I don't know if the
As
band
far as
remembers that, but I think they had shirts too made from the fan.
yeah, oh, that's really cool. It must have been exciting back then, right at the start, though, on that sort of
Well,
journey.
well, it was always chaos in that band, but just the passion of music at the time and the interest of what was going on in the world scene of heavy music. I think that was exciting. I think that was the exciting part where you had different movements in different countries. Really, people had the passion for the heavy music, and they were coming up with this music in their own dialect. It was their own language. So I really
Yeah,
appreciated that because it was very original. It wasn't if you look at history, you kind of have, you know, you have the pioneers that paved the way, and then you have the settlers that kind of come after them. And the
yeah,
settlers are not the pioneers; they're the ones that come after. But the pioneers are the ones who didn't have anything and they had to figure it out. That would be like
yeah,
Jimi Hendrix. Figure out how to make it work and get the sounds they're looking for and create that, pave that way. Then once that road is paved, other people can drive down it, and then you have the colonizers. All that. We won't get into the history part, but as far as the music at that time, you of course had heavy metal. You had some heavy sounding bands that had double bass drums and all. I mean, there was the footing for this thrash thing, this music called thrash. However, you really didn't have, people are still, I mean, let's put it this way. Judas Priest still had Dave Holland. They were still doing, single kick bass drums, even though they had Les Binks with the double bass. And you had bands like Accept that came before with Fast as a Shark and Restless and Wild and all that, the whole double bass kind of thing going on, as well as, bands like Saxon. I mean, and also the new wave of British heavy metal bands that were lesser known, but were certainly significant in that realm. So there was a
yeah,
kind of a crossover, not the word crossover, but there was a crossover between, because everything becomes a genre that people want to put a label on. But this is before that. Punk rock was an influence of heavy metal to a certain extent. I mean, I came
yeah,
from New York City, New York area, tri-state area. So you had the Ramones, from there. You had Kiss that were from there, and that's we can get into that. But bands like the Ramones, bands like Twisted Sister. I mean, there was a whole punk scene in New York that I was part of. Not the hardcore punk, the original punk scene where the Sex Pistols came over, and you had punk bands in New York, Dead Boys. You had a lot of more obscure bands that were punk. So there was some bands that kind of leaned on melody. Some of them were just not the kind that could play their instrument well and just spit on the crowd. They were that kind of sound. Just gritty and very raw. And but that was, you know, what was happening in the '70s at that point. You know, I think the glam rock thing, the David Bowie, you know, glam rock kind of New York Dolls thing, that kind of I don't know, people, the music was good, very good, but it just, it went to a harder edge, you know. I
Yeah.
think with bands like the bands ones I mentioned, Riot, also being from New York, Fire Down Under, you know, it just kind of lent itself to the next stage, you know, the next, you know, what's next. And it was that excitement of this harsh environment in New York, which, you know, was at the time of that era, it was pretty, you know, pretty an aggressive place to live. Let's put it that way. Not that it's any much different today, but you know, in Times Square, it wasn't Disneyland. You know, they turned it into Disney World, Disneyland, Disney Square, whatever. It wasn't like that. You know, it wasn't safe to be anywhere.
Yeah.
You know, you can get jumped anywhere. You know, it was that kind of a place. And you know, there was good people there, but there was also not good people, and
Yeah.
people that were poor or hungry or desperate or jealous or whatever you want to think about. That's, you had it in New York. It was a melting pot of all different types. But that was also the beauty of it, is that you had a melting pot. You had all these great cultures, all these great people from different places that brought something, you know, to the table. They brought their culture and their energy and their excitement. Nowadays, I think things have changed. You know, it's a lot different now, and we won't
Yeah.
get into that. But as far as the music, then I think people were very passionate about their version of music. You know, you had bands from France like Warning and Sortilege and H Bomb, and you know, all of these amazing bands that you know, sang in their own language. You know, they didn't try to sing in English, which was great.
Yeah.
I thought that was very authentic. You know, if you want to talk about authenticity, that was authentic. You know, you had loudness in Japanese. You know, it was the way I liked it.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, I didn't understand Japanese, so it's a lot easier to sing along if it's in English. I think that's kind of the idea, right? They
Yeah.
they were forced to have to do it in English in order for people to, you know, to market it. That's basically the way it works, right? Everything's in English. But
Yeah.
it was
Well,
nice to have Ram,
Rammstein's managed to do it.
Ramstein.
Yeah.
That's, you know, I wasn't really exposed to Ramstein right at that moment, but I was aware of them. They're, you
Yeah.
know, they're, you know, I was more into the Scorpions. I was more into melodic type of hard rock
Right.
and heavy metal. I mean, I like Lucifer's Friend. I mean, I like great German music, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, the metal that came out of Germany. I mean, everything that comes out of Germany was fantastic. I mean, Solingen Steel. You know, how you gonna, the beer? You know, I mean, it's just, you know, on another level. So for
Yeah.
me, it was always a dream. You know, like, hey, you know, Dieter Dirk Studios and Scorpions, and you know, getting a chance to, you know, I do interviews as well. So I've interviewed Uli John Roth more than once. So I had that opportunity. So that's been really cool. But just the passion for that. I mean, I think it's not just the thrash metal thing, but it's before that. There was a passion for, you know, Led Zeppelin when they came out with albums, and you know, they had this design on album covers where it was this mystique, and you know, you had you know, the production was great for those days, and just appreciating the artistry, you know, then. So that's what I carried forward, you know, is that idea of the artistry and the mystique. And you know, then came the MTV era where everything was just, you know, everything was exploited.
Yeah.
You know, everything is pushed out there. Everything has to be in a video, or it has to be, you know, visual aspect to it, not just a concert. And you know, I think what we learned is that bands that just stand there and play their instrument versus people that, you know, get the audience engaged. I mean, you don't have to jump up and down like a, you know, like an attention seeker. You can just, you know, play your instrument. You know, if you look at bands like Slayer or Megadeth, I mean, they don't have to bounce on trampolines like some of these new metal bands, right? I mean, it's just silly, you know, bouncing on trampolines. It's
Yeah.
like it's like children in the with the little colored balls and a big you know, blow up playland thing on their front
Yeah.
lawn, you know.
Uh, Try to bounce on a trampoline when it gets to my age. They'll not be able to do that.
Well, some of us can do it, but it's like I'm just not into all the special effects. I just play my instrument, just want to sing, just want to
Yeah,
play guitar, just want to do what I do, and you know, I don't think it's necessary to, if you're really making a connection, you could be BB King and connect with the audience and not have to, get on
yeah.
a trapeze or something.
See, when I was younger, I got into the heavier side of things, like the early Saxon, Iron Maiden. I'm still a massive Iron Maiden fan, but the first two
Oh yeah.
albums, which was very punk, even though Steve Harris denies it, it had a punk influence, a punky sound to it, especially with Paul Di'Anno's vocals. So for me, the early Iron Maiden, it's same with the early Megadeth, first five, six albums of Megadeth. Absolutely loved them, and early Anthrax, and I just like the noise, the aggression. Some other things, a bit like Slayer and Venom. I also got heavily into, but the more melodic stuff that you were talking about, I didn't really get into until at a later age.
Right.
It's as I calm down, my music tastes calm down.
Well, you were mentioning about Iron Maiden, about Paul Di'Anno, and I had a chance to play shows with Paul, so he's a great person. I mean, I really admired him and always loved him
Yeah,
as a singer. And there was a certain flavor of Iron Maiden, that really appealed to me. And the punk part of Iron Maiden, I think, was Paul Di'Anno. I think a large part of it. I mean, also you had different members. You had Dennis Stratton, you had,
yeah,
Clive Burr. These were members that I think added their own, um, you know, there was a certain feel that they brought to the table,
yeah,
that Clive Burr brought to the table, that Dennis Stratton, that earlier Maiden um, inception. Now, for Steve Harris, he was always a kind of a technical bass player. He's always there's a lot of movement on the bass, right?
yeah,
And he played with his fingers. So for him, probably he wasn't thinking punk, But for Paul Di'Anno, I think yeah, he was thinking more. There might have been more influences of punk rock bands in his whole perception. So I think for me, I came from this place where I worked at Max's Kansas City, in the late 70s and the early 80s. And I also worked at the Ritz when it first opened in New York City.
yeah,
And I was, 15, 16 years old at those, between the two places. So, I saw a lot of bands in that era because I worked there. I was there working, right? And, and experienced, the back end of the punk scene. I wish that I could have had, maybe a few more years ahead because that would have given me, a little bit more at Max's. It was a great place, and it was kind of like the Rainbow, but Rainbow Bar and Grill in Los Angeles, but it was like that in the 80s. It was kind of like that, but a little bit different. And, they had great food. It was a great place to, get to know, talk to people, meet people. It was a different vibe in New York at the time, but there really
yeah,
was no scene. It really wasn't like, hey, let's go hang out on the Sunset Strip like in New York. You had a very isolated few places. Like you could go to CBGB's and Great Gildersleeve's over there on Bowery and the Lower East Side, and those were a couple of venues. But there wasn't like a bunch of people hanging out outside. In fact, usually the good stuff was happening inside, not on the outside on the street. It was cold, or most of the year, you had to go inside the club. Otherwise you're breathing smoke. People would be, but it was really, there's a great scene going on. I mean, it was buzzing with the music, and you had Electric Lady Studios on 8th Street in the Village. There was a whole section of part of town where, it was kind of a lot of artists would be there, but it wasn't a scene that I would call something that would compare to LA or maybe even London, where you had, I'm trying to think of the neighborhood where they have the market.
yeah. Camden.
Camden. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
so Camden had a scene, and there was a scene in London, but I mean, when I was in France in 1984, I went there with, you know, with Carl Kennedy, who got me involved with this thing with the band that he was playing with, not the Rods. So I went over there, and Rhett Forrester, So I knew Rhett, I knew Carl, and so I was over there, and I was supposed to play with the band, but didn't end up singing. But the promoter brought me over anyway. So this is right after
Yeah.
I left Anthrax. But the thing that was interesting is I saw with my own eyes, with my own experience, there was such a division. You know, it was such a divided situation. You know, you had the skinheads, you had the heavy metal long hairs, you had, you know, it was not there was no symbiosis, there was no synergy. It was like this.
Yes.
And they saw you with long hair, they wanted to fight you, they wanted to attack you. Not very different than it is today in other areas. Not for music so much as politics, right? Politics is like that. People want to attack each other. They want to, you know, you can't have a civil discussion with someone that has a different worldview or something. So
You
when it comes
can't
to,
anymore.
yeah, with music, it was like that. It was really like
Yeah.
that. So if people were punks, it's like mods and rockers. I guess you would know more about that than me because that was really
Yeah.
a British thing, wasn't it, or a
Yeah.
European?
My sister was a mod.
So some people went with the Who, right?
Yeah, that's right. She were into the Stray Cats and the Who and things like that. It not my thing at all.
Yeah, and then you know, I mean, but what's wrong with liking all music? What's, you know, it's kind of like tradition versus, and I think that's really what it is. It's really tradition. It's like what your parents were used to, what they told you is the gospel, and how you were raised, and what you grew up with. And maybe that could have been classical music in those days, you know, and you
Mm.
said, hey, you know, this classical music's cool. I'll take it and use it towards rock because think rock is really cool. But the parents
Yeah.
might say, nah, we don't like that rock stuff. We like that classical music only. You're not allowed to play rock in our house. You know, we don't want to hear that. So, I mean, I think that that's tradition. You know, it's the family tradition or what, you know, the environment you're within. And for
Well, I've
me,
got a good story to do with that actually, with
go
tradition
ahead.
and what your mum and dad are into. You'll like this. My dad was into Metallica and Saxon. He was the one that got me into Saxon. And my mum were into AC/DC and Mark Bolan, T-Rex. And I'd be in my bedroom and I'd put on Megadeth or something like that, or Iron Maiden, Slayer. And next minute, as a teenage boy, this is an utter nightmare. My mum and dad would be in my bedroom. What are you listening to? That sounds interesting. Total nightmare. So came down my Megadeth and Iron Maiden posters, and up went Madonna posters, who my mum couldn't stand. And
Wait
I'd
a
lay
second.
on the bed,
You had Madonna posters up
yeah, and I
because
laid
you
on the
like,
bed.
because you were listening to Madonna or because you're trying to piss your
No,
parents off?
pissed the parents off. I
Okay.
played Madonna on my record player very loudly, and I'd lay on the bed with my Walkman on, listening to Slayer and Iron Maiden.
That's very interesting. That's a very, you know, that's a fascinating study because, you know, it's like if you think about punk rock, for example, it's
Yeah,
kind of the antithesis of you know, uh, of of the establishment, right? We're talking about anti-establishment, right?
yeah,
So that was the kind of the pivot point for people, for young people, you know, to be anti-establishment. That's in the 60s. What did you have? You know, you had a lot of this anti-establishment stuff going on. But we don't have to dig into that, but the 70s were more of the same. And, you know, we have things being done to the society by, you know, the powers that hold
yeah,
the power. And they were creating and causing, you know, these scenarios. And people, I don't know, in those days really understood the communication, the information. You know, there was no WikiLeaks or anything like that. You didn't, and even the internet, you didn't have that. So people were in the dark, kind of like they are today. They just think they know everything, right? Everybody knows everything, but they don't.
yeah.
And
We know nothing.
because where are they getting the information from? So I think music was different because, you know, people were sharing. You had tape traders, you had people sharing, you know, you had albums, but it was record albums and there was
Yeah,
cassettes. So it was a little bit harder to get, you know, you can't just burn a copy of something, you know, yeah, you might get a tape of something. You might tape it off the radio. I mean, there were
yeah,
some very cool concerts they had on the radio that you could tape on the air on the radio, and I was fortunate to be able to tape some of those, and was excited that, oh wow, this is a live concert by one of my favorite bands. This was
Yeah.
a cool thing. So you're trying to find out about this because you didn't have it posted on the internet. They didn't post it on a social media app to say, oh, this is when Judas Priest or Iron Maiden or Scorpions or Black Sabbath are playing at the venue, or Led Zeppelin, and you could tape it off the radio. Like, wow, that's an exciting event back then. Nowadays, people don't care about much, but they got satellite radio or whatever, or internet streaming. But for me, I'm always excited when I can, go back in time and find some of these shows or find some events that happened that maybe I was at some of them. And it's just exciting. I mean, for me, it's kind of like, I guess it would be like a child on something like Christmas or their birthday. They get something they really were hoping they never knew existed, and it's better than they thought, and they're excited to open the package and look at this amazing thing here. So to me, that's, I guess for a musician, that would be like, a guitar that really plays well, and you're excited to pick it up or find it in the first place. And,
There's a lot of bootleg albums doing the circuits at the minute of a lot of different artists from back in the day, and you can get like old concerts. And I've got a couple down there, a couple of Iron Maiden ones, bootleg from Paul Di'Anno days, which had been recorded and put out on vinyl. It's brilliant having to be able to put something on it. It's a little piece of history, isn't it?
yeah, there's also a competitive advantage for musicians today, not just from the standpoint of technology, having, an ease of many tools. I
Yeah.
mean, from a standpoint of, the different tools that are available, not just having the streaming services, but I mean, you can pull up a band on YouTube or find something on the internet just to see what does it sound like,
Yeah.
get an idea, or social media. Now, in the days of, the 70s or something, 60s even, that doesn't exist. You'd be lucky to go to a public library and maybe they had a CD or a DVD of something, because they did in those days
Yeah,
sometimes,
yeah. That's how I started.
of
Um,
one band that you even liked. They might have like a bunch of crap, but then there's all of a sudden, oh wow, here's a band, like, oh, they have a Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock or something, just anything that
yeah,
might be of interest. It's like, okay, well, I would definitely want to take that and watch it. I haven't seen that, because you'd have to buy it back then. If you didn't have that record, or you didn't have the vinyl, or you didn't have the CD, or whatever time frame. If you're talking 70s, 80s, even 90s, but then everything is ripped off. All of a sudden, everything is duplicated. It's online, and
yeah,
the last I checked, when I was back in the 80s or 90s, you had to have a special access code to access the software that you were trying to install. If you didn't have that access code, it wouldn't work. So,
yeah,
of course, things became much more, sophisticated when it comes to the tech that they developed that existed, that they just released. They trickled it out to the general public. Of course, they had 100 years of advancements. They just kind of said, oh yeah, we'll give you another 10 megabytes or a gigabyte. Here you go. We'll give you a terabyte now. It's like, well, they can do much more than that, but they kind of trickle it out little by little. So we had the ability to, okay, now we can duplicate a CD or a DVD, and it's like, oh wow, we're not just doing a tape to tape or a VHS to VHS thing like that. So the issue is that, why is it all of a sudden that everybody could just rip off everything? We're not just talking about music, but even movies and even software, everything. Like nothing, like they can just copy everything. I think there's something bigger behind that. It's not just by accident that happened, because what that really does is it takes the power away from the artist. It takes, you can't, it's very hard to be a Michael Jackson level, John Lennon, Elvis level person, And certainly that's not my aspiration. I'm just here for the music, but when you become that big, I think that's a threat, to certain
yeah,
folks. I mean, that's, you have a lot of followers, you have a lot of influence, but I think that the beauty of it is those folks, whether it was the machine that made them or, just their great artistry, they're all great artists, and they achieved these great things, and then their opinion had an impact. But I think that it's great that existed in our society. And nowadays, in heavy metal, at least hard rock and heavy metal, who is the last person that was, I mean, there are some bands out there that we've heard of that, are on festivals and they play a lot and they're out there, but it's not really it's not quite a simple thing to achieve that. I think that people in general, they're more creatures of habit. They like to hear what they're familiar with, or what they're going to order the same pizza from the same pizza place with the same toppings. They're not going to change it up. They're not going to change it up every time. They're just going to do the same damn thing. There's some that might do different things, but I think that's the problem with music. And the other problem is that they just want to hear the same Led Zeppelin cover band, the same Journey tribute band. It's like,
yeah,
whatever happened to original music? And that's where the intelligence, where the science and the artistry collide and synergistically come together, and we hear new bands. Like the music that came out, back in the 70s, for example, there was a lot of creativity. In the 60s, they were pioneers. In the 70s, I guess it was the Settlers. They kind of came in there, and bands like Thin Lizzy and AC/DC,
yeah, yeah.
These were established directions that didn't sound like somebody else, and
Yeah.
I
I'd
think
rather listen. I'd rather
musically
listen
that's
to new
that's where I like to
music.
come from. I like to come from an
Yeah,
artistic standpoint, and I'm a composer. I write songs, I write lyrics, so
yeah,
I think that, to me, that's what is brilliant, and trying to understand that, how that works, and how it comes about, how it comes together. And these are two different things: being a performer, being a singer, a guitar player, and being a song creator. An idea, coming up with creative ideas. And also, that's an interesting subject, because I mean, I did it with Anthrax, and I also did it with Quiet Riot. I co-wrote with Frankie Banali and Neil Citron, so I'm on the last Quiet Riot album. I have a couple of songs, and
yeah,
I've also done it with other people. And for me, I'm always thinking about that aspect. Writing, and the thing that's unique about my perspective is that I'm not just writing in one genre. Part of the problem in the past was, I'm writing a song, and it's like, well, this song sounds really cool for a different band.
yeah,
It doesn't
yeah,
quite fit the mold of what this band is doing, but maybe we could do it for some other thing. And
yeah.
that's kind of how I came up with Jonas Hornquist, who I was working with for, a decade. We came up with a band called Bleed the Hunger. So we came up with these more, vintage classic hard rock / heavy metal. It was more
Yeah.
like the components of a Deep Purple Rainbow kind of a sound, maybe more radio friendly, because we had these songs that were melodic, and it was like, okay, but it has keyboards. So it's not really thrash, and it's not really fitting into that aspect,
Yeah.
a power thrash type of thing. So it's like we came up with these songs, and a lot of them, over an album's worth, and it's like, this really fits this band over here pretty good, but it doesn't really fit Death Riders or Neil Turbin, or
Yeah.
it doesn't really fit Treasureland. So we're like, okay, this is great. So we'll just make this band a separate thing, and these songs go in that bucket, right? So as a songwriter, a composer, that's how we think. It's like, and then I also do rock and soul, R&B, vintage classic standards. Some of these songs that are existing songs that are great, but there's a lot of
Yeah.
room to bring them, kind of tailor them to the way you deliver it, the way you would do it. So
Yeah.
in some cases, there's classic songs you don't want to touch because they don't really change much. They don't. It's kind of hard to take a song like Highway to Hell and make it not remind you of Bon Scott. Make it not remind you of AC/DC. It's like, but it's possible. I mean, there's a young lady who, this girl who's in her teens at the time, and she was doing Bohemian Rhapsody, but she did it in such a demure and very low-key kind of way. She wasn't trying to be, Freddie Mercury, but it was brilliant. She did a phenomenal job. I mean, who would have thought that you could take that song, Bohemian Rhapsody or Don't Stop Believin', don't touch those. You know what I mean? Like that's like to take that and try to turn it into another thing. I mean, that's a challenge. I mean, it's like a science project.
You did the cover of AC/DC Touch Too Much for your solo album. But
Right.
Jesse Hughes of Eagles Death Metal, he did two AC/DC songs when he mashed together, but he was singing it in the style of, oh God, my brain's just gone. Bolan, Mark Bolan, T
Nice.
Rex. He did it in the style of T Rex, which was very interesting. And he
Well,
says,
that's cool. That's a great, I love the interpretation and the artistry. That's what that is. And Jesse, I've talked to him before, great guy and very talented. And, yeah, that's what artistry is. It's taking something and making it your own. But
yeah,
but the thing about that, Dale, is you can't just, some people, they're like, oh, well, I'll change this and I'll change that. It's like, okay, so you want to change it, why? You want to change it to put your name on it, or do you want to change it because it makes a song better? And
yeah,
how can you make a song better if you don't understand the song? How can you change something if you haven't mastered it? You have to become a master of that song. You have to play that song hundreds, if not thousands of times to understand what that song, every centimeter, every decimal point of that song, every measure, every inflection. You have to really be a master of that song. And then once you've mastered the song, you really understand it, you've memorized everything, you know how it goes in your sleep. I mean, you can really deliver that song well, the way that it stands, the original way. Then you can take the song and manifest something even greater, in some cases. Not always. It's not always possible to, there's limitations well, I guess as Bruce Lee famously said, the only limitation is no limitation.
Yeah.
So in other words, that's all in your mind. Like it's all in your head. Like if you think there's like limitation, you're not limited. It's just that we've been conditioned in the society to have limitations, and that is absolutely the way that we hear things, see things, and perceive things. For me, when I think of music, I don't have limitations, but there's certain places where I feel more, where the gravity feels a little bit more flowing. So I just feel like, okay, this is maybe something that compels me, that draws me into it. And so when songwriting happens, and someone's working with, we're collaborating on something with a person, and they play, here's the song they really want to play for me. So they play me a song. I'm like, okay, I get it. They like the song, and this is the one they want to play for me. And then they say, oh, here's another song. Yeah, I like that song. This one I actually like a little better, but they like the first one. Then they play me a third song. I don't know about this song, and they play me this riff, and I'm like, it's not even finished yet. It's like, holy smokes, this riff is amazing, and it sings to me, it speaks to me. It's those kind of things where you might think that it was the first one. Some people might think it was the second one, and I thought it was the third one. So it kind of pulls you in. So for me, I just know already that that third song is probably the one we should work on first, because it's easier to write to. And then sometimes there's songs where it seems like it's easy, but they can be tricky. There could be some tricky, the architecture of the song, just the way that the structure is. Some of these songs that seem like they're easy, they're not so easy. And, there might be a tricky, a very hook chorus, but they're kind of like here's a really interesting song for me that I think is a fascinating song to look at. And that song would be by David Bowie. and it's called Young Americans. And did you know who's singing backup vocals on Young Americans?
No.
Of all people, a David Bowie 70s song, Luther Vandross was one of the lead backups on that song. And I don't know if that song made his career as a backup singer, but certainly he was in the video, he got attention, and the chorus is what carried that song. Yeah. So why do I mention the song? Well, you think of that song, Young Americans, you have that in your head, that chorus. And the backup singers is brilliant. All night we were the Young Americans, so it really had this thing. And then you also have these brilliant lyrics by David Bowie. It makes me want to break down and cry, and just the emotion and the delivery. But here's the thing that I'm bringing up. The verses of that song, where David Bowie in the video is playing an acoustic guitar and he's singing a very choppy verse. It's very uncomfortable. And actually, I think vocally, just the singing style of that part of the song, very uncomfortable, very awkward to me. That's just my opinion. I love David Bowie, but to me, I've seen him on Broadway as an actor, and he was the best, most incredible actor that I've ever seen. David Bowie in The Elephant Man. It was incredible. And Keith Richards was there drinking a bottle of Jack Daniels with Patty Hansen. So this is like way back, right? But on Broadway, I saw the premiere of that show. It was wow. So David Bowie, I have much respect for his talent, and he went through all these different things like Ziggy Stardust and all this different theatrical stuff. So I mean, he's just the Diamond Dogs, So he's doing this Young Americans thing, and they did it on Saturday Night Live or something, and he had Luther Vandross singing. I think that launched Luther Vandross's career, and Luther became a huge R&B singer and very talented in something totally the opposite of what David Bowie was doing. David was doing rock and pop music. Luther was doing pop, but it was R&B. But he was such a gospel, such a great singer. But from my standpoint, I appreciate great singers, and I appreciate different delivery methods, techniques. It's not just heavy metal, not just screamers, but I'm into, I like Enrico Caruso. I've always liked a singer like that who sang in opera houses when there was no PA system. 100 plus years.
I grew up listening to him. Yeah.
Pardon?
I grew up listening to Caruso.
You know what I'm talking about. I mean, this guy was a belter. Yeah. He was a balls to the wall belter, and to me that's what some of these heavy metal singers were about. Belting these songs with power, not these little demure soft singers. Someone that really, not someone that's gargling mouthwash like Sesame Street. Mumbling their words, mumblers. Yeah. I like singers. I mean, that's my prerogative. That's my perspective. I mean, I like singers that could really sing. That's why, to me, Biff Byford is still, one of the most amazing singers out there. He's advanced in his age and his years and his experience, but he still delivers it 1,010%. It's incredible. And to me, it's like guys like that, guys like Glenn Hughes. I mean, some of these guys are naturally gifted people. There's some people that are your Stevie Wonders, that just have all this immense talent on another level. But, there's guys like Biff who just keep on bringing it on a fierce level. And then you have these singers they started off wimpy, and these singers still are wimpy, and they got wimpier with time, and they couldn't sing the right way. I think there's a technique of using, of using your wind, your air, using the chi energy, using your body, using your equipment. Since you're as a singer, that is your equipment, your body, your spirit, your body.
Getting it from right down the bottom where your diaphragm is and pushing it out. And Bruce Dickinson, I think he's got better as he's got on. And the last time I heard him, he was phenomenal.
Well, you would hope so, because there's a lot of experience, there's a lot of road miles under those tires, And Bruce was always a great singer, but he's got a lot more experience and a lot more, he's super confident. But I just saw him recently at the Wilton Theater. So yes, on his solo tour. and I thought it
Yeah.
was, he sang brilliantly. He didn't try to overdo it though. He didn't really try to. I think he kind of, when you're talking about stepping on the gas or giving it like over 100% or more, I think he kind of gauges himself. He doesn't try to over
Yeah.
push himself. But because I saw a number of the Beast tour, and that was full on. It was like
Yeah.
the energy. It's like he's a great performer, but as a singer, I think he has a certain approach, a certain style, and I like his style. But I don't try to copy it. I don't try to model myself after Bruce Dickinson.
No.
I think there's a whole division. I don't know if that's the right word, or maybe a direction of singers and bands that went down that Bruce Dickinson road versus, let's say, Rob Halford,
Yeah.
versus let's say a traditional blues singer.
Yeah.
Rob Halford's got high notes and screams and techniques, and Dio does as well, right? But I think
What would
Bruce
you
Dickinson.
describe yours? How would you describe your voice then? What
Well,
sort of style?
let me get to that question, but let me first make my point, and that is that the Bruce Dickinson style of singing, I would say Jeff Tate. I would
Yeah.
say that Ed Guy, Avantasia, that's kind of the Bruce Dickinson background. I mean, in other words, the influence is certainly there.
Yeah.
Now, I won't say that's only Bruce Dickinson, but certainly there's a certain style, a certain direction that comes from that style of singing. So I would say Bruce has had quite an influence on heavy music and singers, and that I would say is a big section of music or artists that kind of, you can probably put them in that bucket and say this is where they, this is kind of the direction of their sound. And I really like that sound, but to me, I do like the Halford sound. I do like, and I'm not just talking about hitting high notes or, like Klaus Meine, for example. I wouldn't put him in the same place where you put Jeff Tate or Halford, because he's got his own thing, really. And I really admire his, and very great melody. And if you think about also the language differences, because of his accent and the articulation, it's much different. So it's actually pretty hard to sing Klaus Meine, because he's got a very German accent, a very European accent on his singing style. Same thing could be said for Japanese or Asian singers. There's a certain variation of how. But I think that's what makes them unique, and I think that's part of their appeal as well. It's great that they have something unique. Ozzy, he sounded unique because of his nasally tone, but you always knew it was Ozzy. It was always identifiable. It was always like you could pinpoint it. It's Ozzy. And I think any singer that sounds like you can identify them, anybody can make pizza. But when they make pizza that tastes like this place made it, always, and it was from there, now that's a pizza, right? That's a real unique version. And to me, I think there's a value in that. I think as someone like an Ozzy, yeah, he might have sounded somewhat nasally, but it's remarkable how his career went from Black Sabbath and what he did with Blizzard of Oz and Randy Rhoads and with Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake. It was remarkable what the music was like. Who would have expected Ozzy? He's kicked out basically he split with Black Sabbath. They parted ways, and all of a sudden, this Blizzard of Oz, like, holy smokes! It's got to be an interesting, weird perspective. Like the guys in Black Sabbath, all of a sudden they saw Ozzy doing his thing, and yeah, he's doing some smaller theaters, and he's doing smaller arenas, and then all of a sudden, boom! They're doing arenas, and all of a sudden, boom, they're headlining arenas, and all of a sudden, boom, it's like, I mean, he didn't really come out. He didn't come out and start opening. I mean, but he did open for Motorhead on festivals and stuff. He was, when Blizzard of Oz first came out, but when they started, playing those albums, I mean, those albums were huge, but musically brilliant and vocally brilliant. Like, who would have thought Ozzy could do that? But he was people underestimated Ozzy. That's what happened.
Yeah.
Not as an artist, not as a personality, but as a singer,
An
because
artist.
really he's consistently over the years, like, look at some of the music he put out. I mean, just phenomenal. And I think the same for Alice Cooper. It's like, Alice Cooper, almost like a Bob Dylan at times on vocals. Not something that you're going to get too excited about on notes, on high notes
Yeah.
or something. But when it comes to songwriting and song content, I thought I thought some of his latest albums and some of the songs and videos that he's done are phenomenal. It's like, that's saying something about an artist. They come from decades ago. I mean, they were a successful artist decades ago, but they can keep delivering on a level that is just, even better. Even
Yeah.
better than School's Out, even better than I'm 18. I mean, coming up with, I can't remember the title of this one lead-off song off of a previous album he did, but, recent album, like maybe last year or the year before. It was like
Yeah.
amazing. And to me, that's where it's at. It's like, to be a guy like Biff Byford and, still come out with fierce, over the top energy and music that's just unrelenting, on a level that stands up to Wheels of Steel, Denim
Yeah.
and Leather, Princess of the Night,
Oh, fabulous. Yeah.
I mean, to stand up to that, yeah, they still do it, like that. And to me, that would be like if Riot came out with another Fire Down Under, if they could
Yeah.
never manifest that. I mean, to me, there never was that. That never happened again. And, Judas Priest, Hellbent for Leather, well, I'd say they definitely match that, with British Steel.
Yeah.
I think they matched it with Screaming for Vengeance to a point.
Yeah.
Certainly a bigger album. Was bigger for me as a fan. It was a lot of media on it, a lot of bigger tours, but I mean, yeah, there were some great songs, and what is it, Defenders of the Faith. I mean, to me, that was the era for me, and of course, Sin After Sin, up until, when we had Les Binks in the band,
Yeah.
to me, that album, was it the Japanese album? That was actually one of my favorite ones. The one after Hellbent for Leather, the one that was the live in Japan.
Yeah.
Incredible album, incredible live album. And to me, it'll always be Thin Lizzy. To me, Live and Dangerous, you can't top that. Strangers in
No.
the Night, pretty cool, UFO, but I don't know. The Thin Lizzy, and there's some other strong live albums, but that's where it really comes together. It's like, what do you sound like live? What is the band's energy? How does that come across? And I've always been that kind of an artist, where it's about the live performance, the live energy, or at least that's where I've gotten to,
Yeah.
And so you asked me a question about where do I see myself as a singer. I think I'm kind of different than say, I'm not trying to compare myself, because I don't think of myself in the same, I mean, it's like trying to compare yourself to Jesus or Elvis or Michael Jackson, or I'm not going to compare myself to Freddie Mercury. I mean, I don't have the success that Freddie Mercury had, but I can appreciate his artistry. And, Freddie really got people engaged, playing the piano and singing. It's,
Yeah.
different music than Billy Joel, but Billy Joel got people engaged and brought them in.
Yeah.
Little Richard. I mean, people that just bring in that energy and they draw people into it. To me, that's what it's about. So I would say that my singing influences are more leaning towards, I would say, some portion of Halford back in those days,
Yeah.
and also Ronnie James Dio, who's a huge influence from Rainbow
Yeah.
days. I heard it on the radio, and I told Ronnie one of the times that I met up with him, and I just said, I was 12 years old listening to the radio. It was a radio that was like on an intercom on the wall at a community place, like kind of like a rec room or something. I was 12 years old playing pool And all of a sudden, something like, I don't know if it was Long Live Rock and Roll or one of the other songs, from Rainbow comes on the radio in the 70s. And I'm like, it hit me like Foreigner. It hit me like, those commercial bands, like the melodic vocals, the quality of the voice.
Yeah.
Like you talk about quality of service on an internet connection or a phone connection, like when it's a clear connection and you hear everything clear versus static and bad connection. We have that with mobile phones. The quality of service with Ronnie's voice coming through that little intercom radio thing was like, I heard it clearly, like ringing a bell, as Chuck Berry would say. And it was amazing. It was just amazing. It just, it inspired me at 12 years old hearing this. I'm like, what the hell what is this? Like, wow, this is the energy, the fire that came through that little intercom radio. It was like, to me, that was a moment of like, wow, that I don't think I could do that what he does, but I sure like it. I never did that before. I don't know that I could ever go down that path, but wow, like it just knocked my socks off. It was like, holy smokes. So to me, yeah, Ronnie had an influence on me, but I wasn't trying to be Ronnie. I didn't want to try to copy it. I wasn't thinking like that. And I liked a lot of hard rock stuff too. I mean, I liked the days of Aerosmith and, Rock's album and Night in the Ruts and Draw the Line and all that. And I knew all those songs. And, I was a fan of Led Zeppelin. I was a fan of Deep Purple. I liked the band Kansas very much. I was very much into progressive bands. I liked Yes. Yeah. I liked, Rush. I liked all of these progressive bands at the time. And, but I also liked other bands like Kiss and, the 70s bands. I mean, Ted Nugent was big back then. And he had a big arena show, and he was a wild man. And that was, and he had some interesting albums that were melodic as well. And, the albums that he did with Derek St. Holmes, I mean, some great music that they did. Stranglehold and Hey Baby. And, there was some great, like R&B rock, bluesy rock, very catchy music. And, Ted Nugent had his own sound, regardless of the politics or the personality. I mean, the guy just had, Weekend Warriors. I thought this was kind of cool. I mean, he had great illustration of his vibe, and, it was aggressive. It was kind of like, it was kind of rock, but it was super heavy metal, days.
Yeah.
Like when that was first starting to happen before the new wave of British heavy metal at that time. So I just thought, I'm influenced by all this stuff, all of these bands. And of course, Deep Purple and Black Sabbath, you had, Ronnie and then of course Ozzy's work, and other bands, other newer bands started to come about, and we can kind of dive down the rabbit hole. But I would say some of the more significant ones vocally for me that kind of established where I'm coming from. Now, I grew up also listening. I mean, I didn't have, people buying me records and all this kind of stuff. So I had limited records, whatever I could make money for to buy the record. So, Kiss was a big band for me, Led Zeppelin. But I didn't see myself as a Led Zeppelin kind of singer, like Robert Plant. Ooh, Baby, that wasn't my thing. Ooh, Baby, Baby, like he was great. And I love what he sings. And what he, listening back, it's incredible. Robin Zander was another singer that I really liked a lot, but it just wasn't what my voice wanted to do, what his voice did. So, like, I tried to sing like that out of my throat, and it just wasn't working. I didn't sound as cool as Robin Zander. So I try to find, my world and where I fit in, kind of where does my, what track is my train running on,
Yeah.
It's a different one.
Yeah.
Than some other singers. Some singers have a real low, gravelly voice. Some people are like Lemmy, and some people, but some people sing like Jimi Hendrix or Phil Lynott, and they know what works for their voice. But I was really very influenced by Bon Scott as well, because Bon really had a, kind of a sense of humor to a point, kind of a,
that cheeky
wild
side. And
a little limerick type of aspect, like a little devil, he was incredible. And so that had an impact. Jimi Hendrix, as far as some of the depth of his artistry as well. Now, Jimmy didn't think he was a very good singer, and maybe he wasn't hitting high notes like Aretha Franklin, but I would say that Jimmy, brought a level of layers. He brought depth, he brought soul. He brought soul in a way that was not your typical soul singer thing, but he played with these soul singers. He played with Little Richard. He played with all these guys, so he knew the Isley Brothers. He knew this whole kind of this Motown, the R&B thing.
Yeah.
He knew that. He played on that circuit. But what he brought was rock, and he brought an aggressive kind of rock, but it was more for the time, that era of the 60s when he was doing stuff. But there's something that I recently learned about Jimmy that I didn't really understand growing up. And that is that when Jimmy had, the experience, so he had, Mitch Mitchell, Noel Redding, and they quit the band because Jimmy was basically fooling around with other musicians. He was kind of a very free-thinking, artsy kind of guy. So it was experimentation, right? So he was starting to do some other things, and those guys, they just got, they wanted stability, they wanted something long-term visual. I can understand, and unfortunately that split up, and I really like that group, the experience for Jimi Hendrix. But then he went with Buddy Miles, right, and Billy Cox, and I didn't realize that, with like I didn't understand what was going on, because Jimmy didn't really like his own voice so much, and he had Buddy Miles, who was a great singer, great artist, great drummer. He was just, one of those natural. Buddy Miles was a natural, brilliant drummer, brilliant singer, brilliant artist. That doesn't exist often. You might have one or the other, but you usually don't have a Don Henley. Now Don Henley could play drums, but he never wowed us with double bass, off the chart drumming. But yeah, I'm sure he could play pretty well like that. But that's not what's called for the Eagles, right? They're just playing a drum beat, right? They don't really need all that super aggressive drumming. But for Buddy Miles, though, Buddy was playing some great stuff. But I think that's where Hendrix became like Deep Purple. It's like they became more funky, they became more groovy, they became a different band. Like Deep Purple, when you had Tommy Bolin and Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale, it became a different band. Even though it's the same name, it became kind of a different sound. So I think that's what happened to Jimi Hendrix. I didn't understand that, though. I didn't understand what happened. Why is Buddy Miles singing? Why isn't Jimmy singing? I'm listening to Hendrix. It's and he's got Buddy Miles singing, and then he's singing, that's all. You could hear Hendrix in the background vocal once in a while. And it's what's going on? It sounds like a big party. I didn't understand it because I was in my teens, and I'm like, what's going on here? And then that version of Hendrix was only for a limited part of time. A very short time before his death, unfortunately. And but I think in hindsight, looking back, I can understand Hendrix was evolving. We missed out on some amazing things because what Hendrix would have done afterwards. We look at an artist like Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck started off, was doing stuff with the Yardbirds, and then some of the different variations, some of the different, bands that he had, Beck, Bogart, Appice. His solo work on There and Back, for example, very kind of progressive. The stuff he did with Jan Hammer, super progressive. He did all kind, and then the pop music he did. The stuff he did with Rod Stewart. So there's so much different, variation of kind of like a path that he took, and then later on, Jeff Beck and Beth Hart, and then he would take these musicians under his wing and work with these, musicians like the bass player Cal, who I met, great artist as well. But I'm just saying, he kind of was like this other kind, it's kind of like a Hendrix, just very, very experimental, very creative. and also
Yeah.
still a songwriter. I love what Jeff Beck did with Jimmy Hall. He's a harp player and also a singer, and he did, some pretty commercial stuff. There's a song on There and Back. It's called "It Gets Us All in the End." Very,
Yeah.
very much a hit, kind of a pop song. So I just thought it's like really unbelievable when you have an artist like that, and you see their path and how they evolve. And I think Judas Priest as well. If you look at the path of how they've evolved over the '70s and '80s, and I mean, gosh, they have new fire, new life in the band, and a great new version of Judas Priest. But for me, I'll always love the old version because that's really, what I grew up with, and what I saw them live many times, and
Yeah.
you know, to me, that's what I take with me. So as a singer, as an artist, I bring that through what I do, and that energy and that fire. I mean, to me, I really love, I love Biff Byford. I love Fire Down Under, Riot. I love Accept,
Yeah. Yeah.
Restless and Wild, Breaker, Balls to the Wall, Metal Heart. I mean, I love the old Michael Schenker, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
earlier, Gary
Definitely.
Barden, and and Gary Moore, everything
See,
Gary Moore's
I
done.